and thank you all for joining me. I am aware that for certainly those of us in the UK, it's later in our afternoon, and I am standing between you and a glass of wine or a cup of tea, whichever is your personal preference. And I want to extend a special thank you to Matt and Scott, who is currently slurping at an iced coffee. I'm very jealous, for joining this panel from the States. It's not often that we manage to get people from 2 different continents in one panel, so thank you. When Yadu approached me to run a session for the Rave Technologies conference this year, I wanted to talk with small publishers and society publishers about the technical aspects of transformative agreements, because typically when we talk about transformative deals, whether that's subscribe to open, read and publish, the amazing ACM model, which I'm hoping Scott will give us an insight into, we speak a lot about business models and sales channels, but we don't think about how technology can help small publishers, society publishers, facilitate such deals. So I'm going to start with my first question to the panel, which is, when considering a transformative agreement, most libraries ask us for a lot of information, particularly about authorship histories for their researchers. As society publishers, how did you go about compiling that information? And Scott's got his audio on, so I'm going to start with him.
Thanks, Tasha. First of all, thank you all for being here. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about our experiences over the last year or so in rolling out our new transformative model. Probably most important to say that when we built our model back in, let's say 2018, 2019, and early 2020, when it was rolled out, we did this collaboratively. We as a society didn't build a model and then thrust it upon the library community, university environment. We chose to work closely with a group of large research universities. And so the first step that we went through in that process was data collection. And there were really 2, I would call, sort of main elements, categories of data. Publication data was obviously critical to understand what we were publishing, quantities of content that we were publishing in terms of number of articles, where those articles were affiliated, what institutions they were affiliated with, introducing the concept of corresponding authorship into that data collection, and then sort of building that data sort of at scale. Going back not just a year or 2, but going back as far as we could, so we could examine trends over time. Because of course, if you're looking to develop a model for open access, you want it to be sustainable, and you don't want it to be based on 1 year's worth of data. So looking back for us, it took five years or so of back data to inform our decision making. The second piece of this, of course, was financial data. So understanding at a very detailed level what it actually costs to run a publications program, and breaking that down at a very, very detailed level, of course, down to the article level. Many publishers have models that are based on APCs. Ours is not based on APCs, but it is important, nevertheless, to understand what is the true cost of publication. And so that gathering was done throughout the organization at ACM, finance department, our technology group, our production group, and trying to use some external sources to vet that information. So all kinds of data and metadata kind of went into that. And I'm sure you'll ask more detailed questions later, but that was sort of the fundamental effort. And then taking that data and sharing it in a very transparent way, sharing everything that we have about financial cost data and publication data with our partners, so that we could really evaluate whether the models that we were considering at the time would truly be sustainable over the long term.
So, Stuart, I'm going to pick up on that with you, because you mentioned earlier today that actually some of your publication data has come from third parties such as Scopus instead of from your own systems. Well, you didn't think I was going to leave that one on the table.
Yeah, I knew that surprised you. We're a little bit later to the table with this stuff than many others. I mean, we did start exploring the possibility of doing these sorts of deals about 3 years ago, actually, and we didn't get very far. I mean, at that time, I think people were busy doing deals with bigger players than us. I also think the landscape has moved massively in the last 12 months. And so it has been easier for us to get a seat at the table. And as a result, we've now got several deals in place for next year. I mean, actually, we've kept our model very simple, really. We based it on historic publishing rates from the institution and on historic subscription spends. And we've combined a read and a publish fee. And that's kind of how we've done the deals. I mean, we've essentially copied what everybody else has done in the main. Some of the forerunners on this, very cool. I mean, in terms of the actual data, I mean, so we have our own publishing platform, Atipon, which gives us the data on actually what we publish in each journal, what's open access, all the author information. We then cross-check that against Scholar One from Clarivate, which is our submission system, where authors have to provide a bit more granular data and also grant numbers and all that kind of thing. But we do, you're right, we do cross-check it against Scopus as well. I mean, it's frustrating that we are dependent on so many different systems. I mean, I think partly that's being a small player, but I guess it's just that there are also quite a lot of systems out there. Now, Scopus has been a bit frustrating, I might say, because the data in there is not always as reliable as I would like it to be. Partly because they have a very strange approach to what they consider an open access article is. They basically put an open access tag against anything which is free to read. So that means that in open access week, when we drop our paywalls, we become an 100% open access publisher for a week. Now that's not really very helpful, but so, I mean, it's a combination. So we kind of cross-check against all those things, where the author's coming from, who they're funded by, what they published in which journal, over what period of time. And then we kind of cook all that together.
Malavika, you look like you have something to add.
So thanks, Tasha. Things that I hope will be helpful for this audience, just building on what Scott and Stuart have shared, to call out that in our instance, we could only go back a couple of years because we had moved certain systems, or we had moved from a very manual way of doing things on an editorial processing system to actually a partnership with a vendor provided system. So our editorial information was only reliable back a couple of years. So there's that to consider. To answer your original question, Tasha, we had to hand stitch and manually put everything together from what was residing partly in our APC billing system, partly in our editorial processing system, partly in our subscription fulfillment system to look at who actually subscribes. And bear in mind, I mean, that took a tremendous amount of work, but bear in mind, that's only to get an offer out. That's only to compute what value can we place on a read and publish deal. Then think about actually delivering the workflows that have to validate against certain authorships being at a transformative institution or not. And then think about the reporting that we have to do to measure success in these deals. It's actually a technological nightmare. And I think from the technology perspective, what might have helped, although we're all in new ground here, you can't always foresee these things, what might have helped would have been more integration between these systems. They have grown up as individual systems to serve a certain purpose, but we're seeing the transformative landscape pull together what's traditionally content and what's traditionally sales and finance. And all of that actually needs to reside together.
I can't disagree. I was the person doing the stitching for the Microbiology Society. Matt, we've not heard from AGU, but you've got a fairly chunky publishing program compared with some of the small UK societies. How did you tackle this?
Yeah, well, so we're lucky in a lot of ways because we're partnered with a larger publisher, Wiley. So some of in terms of providing information to libraries and doing that negotiation was sort of taken care of by them, which makes us lucky in one way, but we still had to track a lot of this data in order to understand what it was going to do to our portfolio, because we have a number of fully open access journals, and then we have 2/3 of our journals are still hybrid subscription journals. So we needed to know what would happen, and we did encounter some of the same issues with we used dimensions and Scopus and all sorts of data, and particularly unsub or unpaywall, as it was previously called. That data was actually really important because it does label whether it's a gold OA or bronze OA, the different color coding, and it was important for us to know where we were currently with what we were sort of making freely available in different ways versus what was available gold, and we're using that information to make decisions about what to do with individual journals going forward. And I think the other important thing that I've learned sort of as a bystander is some of what Malavika was saying about the negotiations with the libraries are they're really intense, they take a long time, and a lot of it is not just based on the costing, but how are you going to connect the systems from the library and the publisher, because they have to look at each author and where the funding is that the authors have from various places, grants, et cetera, and what portion's coming from the library's deal versus a grant, and how do we, and then if people are at different institutions, it's even more complicated. And those things I think are, that's an area where technology can really help us figure out how to receive payments from multiple sources.
Well, that speaks very much to this idea of a lack of accuracy and consistency in the metadata that publishers are receiving from authors, or that potentially lack of accuracy and consistency in the data that authors are given by their funders, for example, in how to refer to their grants. JISC, obviously in the UK, have a project at the moment looking at persistent identifiers, but from your stance, from your perspective, what could technology or technologists be doing to help improve that aspect of this piece of work? I'm going to go back to Matt because you're right in my eye line.
So for us, I think one of the things we're seeing is, again, you touched on it, that authors can report their grant in various ways in the funder, and we're not seeing enough standardization of how that's reported, and our systems aren't really able to do the matching yet, so that when authors starting to type something in about their grant, we're not saying, oh, is this what you mean? And then as you said, I think it still happens where we expect a certain funder to be called one thing because they state that that's what their entity is, but then they're instructing authors to refer to their grant in a different way. So we have to catch those things and match them. And I'm sure it's still going on, but I know of even some cases where we've helped to fix that. It's just lots of moving pieces.
So Malavika, I know you and I have spoken about the challenge of matching institutional identifiers between authors and subscribers. Is that something that you've been trying to tackle, or that you would find useful if somebody could come up with magic technology that would plug that gap?
Absolutely. I mean, if there's a nice simple way to help with this, then that would be great. And I think the point I'd want to make here is one from the perspective of a small society publisher, is one around human resourcing and how actually we need technology to solve these problems, because as a very small independent society publisher on the sales front, we are 3 people, and that includes me, and my job is not sales, right? So to smooth through these inconsistencies and to recognize that now that we're bringing operations that live in different systems together to be able to combine up a read and publish deal, for instance, to be aware that pivots in certain workflows or messaging that needs to vary based on if somebody's at a transformative institution or not, those kind of dependencies can come from someplace totally else, right? So that can be from another system, which currently they don't speak to each other, or that can be author dependent, and that's where you need consistency and the persistent identifiers to kick in. So the way we're getting around it at the moment is we are using Ringgold identifiers. They used to live in our subscription system. We've had to now get that information and make sure that our editorial system picks up Ringgold. Then there is an author dependency so that they are correctly identifying themselves. There's the whole parent-child nightmare of the Ringgold stuff. And then hopefully it all validates correctly, and then they can go through a transformative route. And I will stress, in all of this, our transformative pilots have been live throughout 2020. The automation is still not in place. So this is taking a long time.
Yeah, manually checking whether authors are allowed to go through a transformative deal is challenging. We have a question from the audience, which I think is from Company of Biologists, which is, how do you assess the portion of open access fees coming from author grants versus payment from an institutional pot? Which I think sort of goes back to the conversation about libraries wanting to recharge a proportion of their read and publish deals or transformative deals back to funders. Scott, have you tried to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, this comes up in discussions with virtually every university we're talking to. We've signed about 55 to 60 of these deals so far, and probably in half of the ones that we've signed, the librarians, who are the people that we're primarily negotiating with, are looking beyond the library budgets, because these deals, just based on library budgets, are not going to be sustainable for most publishers long term. One of the very, very clear dynamics that we see is that, of course, everyone comes to these deals expecting cost neutrality. So they want their read licenses to essentially cover all of the OA as well. And that's, unfortunately, for some publishers, certainly my own is in this boat, not possible, because we've got 2,700 universities that subscribe, but we only have 1,000 institutions that actually author. So, you know, you're basically taking a long tail and trying to push those revenues into a short tail. The main discussion that we've had is how do you do cost sharing within the university? And many of the institutions that we've signed already, and some of the ones that we're talking to, are going around to the university departments. They're going to the deans of research, to the vice provosts of research. They're going to department chairs, because they recognize that the value proposition isn't just one of access, it's also one of publication, and trying to do that cost sharing. What role is there for the publisher in that process? Not a significant one, although the more data that we can provide to them in terms of funding data, what are the research grants that are underwriting the research in the articles that are affiliated with those institutions, the more information we can provide to those institutions, the easier their job will be over time to hopefully successfully do cost sharing. I will say that in a number of cases, they have been successful, because when they do go to the departments and say, our budget, Serial's budget only covers so much, and we want to do these deals on behalf of the authors, and support these centrally within the institution, there is a willingness. And some university departments have already sort of agreed to share some of those costs, which, you know, I think is going to be more and more important over the longer term.
So Matt, you've commented in the chat thread that you've seen authors pay on a credit card and try to get reimbursed from multiple institutions. How do you think that's going to change in a world where most or many authors are covered by these publish and read deals? Do you think there will be some kind of reclaim from the institutions that aren't signed up to these deals?
Yeah, I think we really need a way to have a clearinghouse for this, to negotiate this. Many of the institutions don't have in their policy, they won't reimburse someone from another institution for these expenses. So, and we're seeing it's not easy for the publishers or to sort of divvy up the invoicing in a way. So we really need improvement on this process.
Stuart, with your OASPA head on, or your OASPA hat on, would you maybe give us a bit of an intro to the OA switchboard?
Nicely cued. I was actually just going to bring that in myself. I mean, I think all these issues, untangling who paid what for which article, has been a real nightmare, as Malavika mentioned this earlier on. And I guess it's because the systems that we've got were not built for the world we're now trying to create. So, we're trying to do deals which combine these sort of hitherto somewhat separated universes of, the editorial world and the sales world. And we're now having to have them directly talk to each other. I mean, I think there are some merits to actually being quite a small organization where the process is very, very manual, because at least you do have all the data at your fingertips. I mean, it might not be in a brilliant, linkable sort of state, but at least you have the stuff. But I think this was where the need was recognized for the OA switchboard. Not that long ago, actually, just towards the end of 2018, Paul Peters, who was then the chair of the OASPA, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association, brought a bunch of people together and said, how about we create a central clearinghouse for all this metadata? So, where does the author come from? What have they authored? Which journal is it in? Who's paying the APC? Is it covered by a deal? And if we can have the institutions and the funders and the publishers plugged into this system, then instead of a many-to-many situation, you can greatly simplify that by collecting things together into bundles, so that you could, in principle, arrive at, at the end of the year saying, okay, institution Y, this is your bill with publisher A, right? Now, it's been phenomenally rapid progress, actually. From that idea towards the end of 2018, we now have a functioning product to which a number of people are already signed up as customers for next year, including the Royal Society. So we're one of the launching partners. So that's really an attempt to try and deal with the kind of complexities we've all been talking about, which is there's multiple bits of metadata held in different places, which if we can standardize into a schema, which is what the OA switchboard does, and deliver to the relevant parties, we should at least have something which is reliable and which is standardized in terms of its format, rather than having to multiply check multiple systems. Because we know, authors are not always great at filling stuff in and providing all their relevant numbers, or they may not have the grant number. So I think there's a great hope for the OA switchboard. Let's hope we can bring it to fruition.
Yeah. So Scott has commented that the model that the ACM have put together bases tier pricing only on the articles where the corresponding author or the lead author is affiliated with the participating institution. So there's not really that type of cost sharing, because you don't have an APC in the same way. And Malavika and Stuart, I know your model is very similar. It's based on corresponding author. But to continue from Stuart's point, I mean, there has been a real proliferation of services that are aiming to show researchers whether a specific journal or a specific publisher is compliant with their funder and their institutional mandate. So thinking back, there's been Sherpa Romeo for years, OA Switchboard we've mentioned, the Coalition S journal checking tool has been released in the last couple of weeks. But a lot of these require both publishers and institutions and funders to provide information through a form, check it's then being correctly transcribed into the tool, and request corrections. And that can be quite time consuming. It can be quite painful when a particular provider has repeatedly refused to correct your information. How would you like to see that kind of situation change? I mean, can you envision a world where we have a central repository of deal information that says, here's everything, and whatever service wants to make use of it can make use of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we do kind of have that repository for deal information, at least. I hope that the OA switchboard will deliver a standardized schema, but it has been incredibly frustrating, a number of systems. I mean, I've been in journal publishing for quite a long time, probably longer than any of you by some way. And it's very frustrating because each new service promises to deliver the sort of definitive, set of data. But they all define things in slightly different ways. They ask for regular data uploads, and then they make mistakes and you have to correct it all. And you just think, well, look, why am I correcting 7 different systems? Can we not just have one? And I think we've probably been a bit slow as publishers and as institutions to get onto this problem. But as I said earlier on, it's now is the kind of real crunch point where we actually need this solution. I guess in the past, it's been a sort of nice to have rather than an essential. So the impetus to get it perfect has perhaps not been as strong as it is now.
I would just add, Tasha, I totally agree with what Stuart said. I mean, it used to be that this data was really nice to have and allowed us to enhance our services. But now that the actual business model is getting tied to that data, getting the data wrong has a very direct impact on your annual budgets. I just think about some of the examples that we've had over the last year, is that our model is based entirely on corresponding author data, and also this concept of sort of APC eligible. So while we don't charge APCs as a part of our read and publish deals, there are certain publication types that are included and that we track and report on in terms of data, and certain types that we don't. And we found, for example, that even some of our production vendors are manually changing metadata for a variety of reasons. So an article that might actually be a research article is somehow changed in the metadata. And of course, unless you actually have people looking at this and auditing that data after the fact, it's really, really hard. So one of the things that's built into our read and publish agreements is not just the question of gathering the data and presenting the data and reporting on it, on a regular basis, but also having some independent third party audit that data. So that's one thing. Another thing that we've done from a very sort of tangible and practical perspective, we just recently changed our publication policy. Will go into effect on January 1. All journal authors for ACM will be required to register and record their ORCIDs. And if they don't do that, they can't be published by ACM. And we will be doing effectively the same thing on the institutional side using the ROR identifiers, based on the GRID database, because the name normalization, normalization of that data, it's not the only problem or challenge we have, but it is a big one. And when we look at accuracy of data, that is certainly one of the things that contributes to the cleanliness of the data.
Thank you. Brief reminder to everybody who is listening, if you have questions, please pop them in the chat or in the Q&A. But while we're waiting for somebody, I'm going to refer back to a question that came up first thing this morning or first thing this afternoon in our very first session, which is how can society publishers, charities, feel like they can make a difference when we may struggle to stay afloat in these increasingly competitive times? And I think it was Bridget that asked that, but it's very pertinent. Malabika.
Throw me a tough one, why don't you? Right.
Did you expect anything else?
Fair play. So I guess this is something we're all reflecting on at the moment, and trying to focus. I'm sorry for the shouting, but my son's now home. We're trying to reflect on, given the pandemic context, given the different funder mandates and trying to transition and all of that, what opportunities do we actually have I think we're in a place where we have opportunities to step back and look at what are we providing that actually is of value to the community. And I think a lot of us are seriously stepping back to look at that, to assess it, and then think how we can use the current climate and context to enhance that. So for instance, the current COVID pandemic has brought us as the Biochemical Society into a place where we're sort of capitalizing much more than we ever were before on the synergies of being a self-published society. So we're not thinking so much of charitable activities going on in one silo and publishing activities that are only expected to drive profit and profit alone in another silo, but actually thinking more symbiotically and synergistically about the whole thing. So we've, because of lockdowns, etc., brought out a whole new program of bi-weekly webinars, which are relying quite heavily on the commissioning content people to look at experts around the world that we might want to bring together to talk about something, and linking that up with our events team, who obviously in a face-to-face world, we haven't been able to run those kind of events, but they've pivoted to bringing the discussion online. And what we found is where in the past we've reached maybe attendees from 1 country or 2 countries, we now have attendees from 65 countries. We've got engagement that's increased, more than doubled across the globe. So, you know, I think we're able to connect. If we think about, like, one of our objectives is to bring together molecular bioscientists. Well, we're meeting that objective in totally different ways, and one could argue better than ever before. So it's a time for opportunity, but I think one where we need to step back and evaluate what are the right things to be doing.
Matt, I see that you have a comment. Matt seems to be on mute. Stuart, do you want to come in on that one?
Tasha, you're a little faint, so I don't know who you.
Oh, I was asking if you had a comment to add to Malavika's, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, so we've had a similar assessment that thinking of the different parts of AGU as being siloed will not serve us well. It hasn't served us well, but certainly won't serve us well going forward. And dividing up publications as being some sort of revenue driver versus being integral to the mission of the organization, which is really communicating about science for the benefit of humanity, and in our case, Earth and space sciences, that you know, we have to think in that manner. And in terms of being able to act effectively, we're also looking for partners right now. I mean, our new strategic plan is all about that. It's about broadening inclusivity, with, you know, diversity within the organization, and then reaching out and partnering to do good with other partners who can, you know, who can do some of these things better. So I think that, you know, the sort of Zoom world we're living in is in some ways smaller than ever, and it'll make it easier for us to engage with some of these partners going forward, and absolutely the charitable mission is still there.
Stuart or Scott?
I mean, this is the elephant in the room, isn't it, for learned societies? The fact is that we've, over the last few decades, become quite dependent, in most cases, on our journal publishing income or our book publishing income, which sort of conflicts to some extent with our mission priorities, because it means that we're not disseminating things as widely as we could have been doing, because we're too busy generating unrestricted income for our other mission activities. That's something that we are all having to deal with right now. And it's worth remembering, and I do try and point this out to people, this is a relatively recent idea that we could make a lot of money out of journals. I mean, it's really only since about the 1970s or thereabouts that this started to become realized as a big factor driving our, you know, our profit and loss accounts. But of course, it's all very well to say that when you have a society that is dependent on those revenue streams now, here and now in the real world. So it has to be a compromise, doesn't it? And I think societies, you know, while they have a mission objective or priority to disseminate research and to curate research and to make it reliable and accurate as far as possible, I think they also have a responsibility to demonstrate that that's got to be done in a sustainable way, sustainable for authors, sustainable for institutions, and for us as societies. So I think it's not a question of simply opening the doors and letting everything flow out for free. We've got to say this has got to be a model that will persist into the future. So it has to be economically viable, even if at a somewhat lower margin than it has been in the past, I guess.
Scott, would you like our last word?
Sure. So everyone talks about sustainability. And I think that term means something different to every organization, every publishing organization in the world. And certainly it means something different when you're talking to commercial publishers or nonprofit societies. We decided that as we kind of roll out our new model, one of the results of that model, one of the sort of key impacts of that model on our institutional customers is that about 1/3 of our institutional subscribers are being asked to pay more than they pay today. And in some cases, many times more than they pay today. But about 66%, about 2/3 of those institutions are being asked to pay significantly less over time because they don't publish with us. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to actually do a deep dive into the publication data and to be extremely transparent about that. So you could see, and we published an article, a 5-page article in our flagship magazine, so that when you talk to libraries, they can understand at a very base level what sustainability means for you. For us, we have a 3 to 5% surplus every year on our publications program. It worked out last year at $23.3 million. And for us, sustainability as we move from subscriptions into open access means if we generate less than that level of expense, then we're going to have to make cuts somewhere within our organization. And being very transparent about that and upfront, showing that to every customer out there, it has generated, I would say, a great deal of goodwill on the one hand and a lot of understanding, especially from those institutions when you're asking them to pay 3 times, 5 times or more than they pay today. And so, just the only advice that I would give to those here today is really define sustainability and just don't leave it out there as a general sort of ambiguous concept.
I think that's a great thing to end on. I want to thank Scott, Stuart, Matt, and Malavika again for joining us, and I will hand back to Yadu and the Rave team.
Thanks Tasha and everyone else. It's been great to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Tasha. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you.